On July 1, 1916, 20,000 British soldiers died in a single morning. Not from artillery. Not from gas. From a weapon one man could operate that could fire 600 rounds a minute and that never once had to reload while an entire wave of infantry crossed open ground toward it. This is the weapon that rewrote the rules of war. Here is the verdict. For thousands of years, war rewarded courage. A soldier who charged forward with enough men, enough speed, and enough nerve could break almost any line. Then, in the span of about 30 years, one invention made that entire idea obsolete. The machine gun didn't just kill more efficiently than anything before it. It broke the basic math of infantry combat. Charging became suicide. Trenches became mandatory. An entire century of military strategy had to be rebuilt around one gun. Today we're tracing that weapon from a workshop in London to the worst single day in the history of the British Army, and delivering the verdict on how one invention changed warfare forever. In 1884, an American-born inventor named Hiram Maxim built the first true automatic machine gun. Earlier rapid-fire weapons, like the Gatling gun, still needed a soldier to turn a hand crank. Maxim's design used the recoil energy from each fired round to eject the spent cartridge, load the next one, and fire again, entirely on its own, for as long as the trigger stayed pressed and the ammunition belt kept feeding. One soldier. One gun. 600 rounds a minute. That was more sustained firepower than an entire company of riflemen could produce a decade earlier, and it required a fraction of the men to operate. Maxim reportedly said the gun would help European nations kill each other more quickly, and considered that a service to civilization by shortening wars. He could not have been more wrong about the outcome, even though he was right about the killing. One inventor, working largely alone, had just made the infantry charge, the single most important tactic in the history of land warfare, obsolete. What made the Maxim gun so devastating wasn't just its rate of fire, it was the geometry of how it was used. A machine gun crew didn't need to aim at individual soldiers. They simply selected a fixed line across the ground their enemy had to cross, set the gun to traverse slowly left and right across that arc, and kept firing. The mathematics were merciless. A single gun covering a front of several hundred yards, firing at a belt-fed rate of 600 rounds per minute, could put a bullet into every square foot of that killing ground in the time it took a man to run across it. There was no gap to sprint through. There was no moment of hesitation in the mechanism. The gun did not tire, did not flinch, and did not run out of ammunition as long as the belt kept feeding. Against that kind of sustained, mechanical fire, the traditional infantry virtues of speed and aggression became liabilities rather than assets. The faster you ran, the sooner you entered the killing zone. The armies of Europe had watched this play out in practice before 1914, and the evidence was not subtle. In the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, a British force equipped with Maxim guns killed over 10,000 Sudanese warriors in a matter of hours, suffering fewer than 50 dead in return. In the Russo-Japanese War, Russian infantry assaulting fortified Japanese positions were cut down in numbers that had no precedent in European experience. Military observers from Britain, France, and Germany attended that war specifically to study modern combat, and they filed detailed reports on what machine gun fire could do to advancing infantry. Those reports went into filing cabinets. The lessons were noted, discussed, and then largely set aside, because accepting them fully would have meant dismantling the entire offensive doctrine that European armies had spent decades building their identity around. The machine gun's power was not a secret in 1914. It had already been tested, brutally, in colonial conflicts across Africa and in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, where machine gun fire had shredded massed infantry assaults and produced casualty counts that shocked European military observers watching from the sidelines. And yet, when the First World War began, the major armies of Europe still built their entire opening strategy around the offensive. Masses of infantry advancing in formation, bayonets fixed, trusting that speed, numbers, and morale could carry a position the way they always had. Germany alone entered the war with roughly 12,000 machine guns already in active service, mounted on tripods, sighted on fixed lines, and staffed by crews trained to keep firing without pause. The other major powers had far fewer, and would spend the first 2 years of the war frantically trying to catch up. The technology had already proven what it could do. The armies simply refused to believe it until the bodies made the argument for them. On July 1, 1916, the British Army launched an offensive along the Somme River in northern France, following a 7-day artillery bombardment intended to destroy German trenches and cut the barbed wire in front of them. If you watched our deadliest single day's countdown, you already know this day earned its place on that list. What that ranking didn't have room to explain is exactly how one weapon did most of the damage. The bombardment failed to do either. German machine gun crews had sheltered deep underground in reinforced dugouts, and when the barrage lifted, they climbed back up, set their guns on pre-registered firing lines, and waited as roughly 100,000 British soldiers began walking, not running, across open ground toward them, weighed down with 60 pounds of equipment each, on the assumption that nothing German remained alive to resist them. They were wrong. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered around 57,000 casualties, including approximately 19,240 dead. The worst single day in the history of the British Army, before or since. A large share of those casualties came from a small number of German machine gun positions, each one capable of firing faster than an entire battalion of riflemen. One machine gunner, positioned correctly, with a clear field of fire, could stop an assault that had taken months to plan and cost millions of shells to prepare. The Somme did not fail because the plan was bad. It failed because the plan was built for a war that the machine gun had already ended. After the Somme, and battles like it across the Western Front, both sides reached the same conclusion by necessity rather than choice. Standing up and advancing across open ground into machine gun fire meant death on an industrial scale. The only way to survive on a modern battlefield was to not be standing in the open at all. That single fact is why the First World War became a war of trenches, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, rather than a war of movement. Barbed wire, artillery, and poison gas all played their part in the deadlock, but it was the machine gun, sitting fixed and unmoving, that made the infantry charge a losing bet almost everywhere it was tried, and forced both sides underground for 4 years. Militaries eventually adapted, creeping artillery barrages, infiltration tactics, and eventually the tank were all developed specifically to solve the problem the machine gun had created. But that adaptation took years and cost millions of lives to arrive at, because it required abandoning centuries of established doctrine about how wars were supposed to be won. The machine gun did not just kill soldiers. It broke an entire military philosophy, and nothing built to replace that philosophy arrived in time to save the men who paid for the lesson. One invention, built by one man in a London workshop, made the infantry charge, the tactic that had decided almost every major land battle for centuries. into a death sentence. It took the armies of Europe nearly 2 years and millions of casualties to accept what the weapon had already proven on its first real day of use. Here's the verdict. The machine gun is the clearest example in military history of a technology outpacing the doctrine built to use it. The gun was ready in 1884. The tactics needed to survive it weren't ready until 1918. Every life lost in between was the cost of that gap. It wasn't pure stubbornness. Armies were still working out how to coordinate artillery, infantry, and communications across a battlefield that had changed overnight. But, whatever the reason, the men who paid for that learning curve paid in full at the Somme. So here's the question. If the generals of 1914 had believed the evidence sitting in front of them, how many of the Somme's dead do you think could have been saved?